Observe the opening seconds of the track. Before a single lyric is sung, there is only a low, resonant hum. It is the sound of a paralyzed gaze rather than a declaration. This analysis will focus on the surface layer of the song's architecture, a framework we will call Part 1, the tongue. Disassembling the song's lyrical structure requires a sequential, line-by-line examination of the text. When we encounter a web of classical and biblical allusions this dense, we have to ask if the mythology is an intellectual facade or a rare moment of unfiltered vulnerability. The mythic environment translates a somatic reality that is so overwhelmingly grand, only the language of antiquity possesses the scale to capture the impact of the subject's physical presence. To understand how this works, we have to isolate the concept of latent kinematics, the tension between explosive action and passive stasis. We will track this tension across 3 specific lexical domains: the organic, the performative, and the mythic. The song builds its power by layering these competing disciplines to map the surface of a singular human subject. To see how this monument is built, the analysis must begin at the very bottom of the song's acoustic environment. Only a strict chronological derivation of these lyrics reveals how the artist constructs this reality in real time. The opening couplet places the casual modernity of grooving against the liquid distortion of watching from the bottom of a pool. This environment immediately establishes the observer as submerged, looking up at a figure who breaks the surface tension of the real world. We then encounter a syntactic paradox. The subject is moving without moving. This is the definition of latent kinematic power. The language turns imperative, transforming the subject from a static noun into pure, continuous action, a verb. The Jonah allusion illustrates a nested movement. Jonah moves only because the massive ocean and the Leviathan move him. Verse 1 establishes the observer as a passive entity, entirely acted upon and swallowed whole by a divine kinematic force. In the pre-chorus, the grandiose mythic scale suddenly drops to reveal a direct admission of the observer's inadequacy. The observer admits they could never define the subject. Here, the lexicon fails, suggesting the biblical allusions are less an intellectual ornament and more a necessity for reaching toward an experience that defies simple description. The chorus shifts away from cerebral biblical concepts toward organic, earthly elements. The willow tree metaphor captures a specific kinetic nature, rooted and static at its base, while whipping violently in the atmosphere. The word naturally strips away these divine projections, recentering the analysis on the physical reality of the lover. By momentarily trading the divine facade for earthly physics, the artist grounds the absolute sincerity of their awe. Verse 2 elevates the lyrics back into a religious register, defining the subject as the literal right of movement. To call this reasoning lucid establishes the subject as the liturgical justification for motion itself. This sacred right stands in contrast to the tormented, gravity-defying athletic reality of Sergei Polunin. It is further contrasted against the highly sequenced, calculated elegance of Fred Astaire. The artist explicitly rejects these human performative styles in favor of the cosmic, mythic stasis of Atlas. True kinetic dominance is effortless. By describing Atlas as sleepin', the artist declares the subject requires no performative exertion to uphold the observer's universe. The second pre-chorus frames the subject as a mirror that reflects a lost innocence back at the observer. Describing the movement as flawed and free acts as the antithesis to idealized plastic perfection. The bridge then rapidly stacks aesthetic layers: gray skies, representing heavy, imminent atmospheric pressure; the bird of paradise, representing an exotic, elaborate biological display; finally, the odd sight come out at night, a nocturnal, mysterious, and subversive element. This frantic succession of weather, biology, and mystery reveals an artist desperately exhausting the limits of language to capture the subject. We return to our initial question. Was this mythic facade merely a defensive intellectual shield? A sequential reading reveals a different intent. This architecture suggests an unfiltered translation of somatic awe. The precise deployment of Jonah, Atlas, Polunin, and Astaire builds the central paradox of latent kinematics. The most devastating movements are those executed effortlessly, naturally, and subconsciously. This analysis has isolated the surface aesthetic, the tongue, without bleeding into the underlying psychological grit. The artist speaks in the register of gods and leviathans simply because the human subject demands a cathedral to house their presence. When an audience hears a heavy, rhythm-driven track titled Movement, the cultural instinct is to interpret it as an ode to a lover's dancing. We imagine the ecstatic performance of two bodies in motion across a floor. But strip away the swelling gospel choir and the driving percussion, and the text authored by Hozier reveals something entirely different. It is a clinical study of absolute physical dependency. To understand the actual mechanics of this song, we have to ignore the music entirely. We will treat the lyrics strictly as a data log of a thermodynamic event. Our parameter for this investigation is singular. We will track the semantic inversion of the word move throughout the text, observing how its definition mutates from line to line. In this specific text, movement is never an action taken by the subject. Instead, it is an involuntary structural consequence inflicted upon the narrator. By progressing through the song line by line, we can map an escalating stage of kinetic transfer, where energy moves from an unstoppable source into a completely static recipient. Ultimately, this log charts the terrifying realization that another person holds the structural weight of your entire world, and a single, thoughtless twitch could collapse it entirely. The text opens by establishing a very specific spatial reality, as if through water from the bottom of a pool. This introduces hydrostatic pressure, the crushing force exerted by a fluid at equilibrium due to gravity. By placing himself at the bottom of the pool, the narrator defines his state as a static, sunken mass, pinned down by overwhelming weight. From this pinned position, the narrator observes a kinetic paradox in the subject. You're moving without moving. This paradox eliminates the possibility of literal locomotion across a room. If the subject is not physically traveling, the force they exert is purely gravitational. They are pulling on the environment simply by existing within it. This culminates in the lyric, "And when you move, I moved." This is a complete stripping of agency. The narrator does not choose to respond. The response is extracted from him. The subject does not need active intent or directed effort. The sheer density of their presence alters the physical state of the narrator on contact. The narrator is not standing on a dance floor observing art. He is a passive object trapped in a pressure vacuum, being acted upon by an inescapable external force. The text continues its reclassification of the subject with the lines, "You are a call to motion, they're all of you a verb in perfect view." This relies on kinetic potential, the stored energy within a system that is then released. By reclassifying the subject from a stationary noun into an active verb, the text destroys their objecthood. They are pure physical energy. A call to motion in this context is a biological and systemic imperative. It is an order issued by physics itself, one the narrator lacks the mass to refuse. The text then provides the mythological evidence for this entrapment, like Jonah on the ocean. The physical reality of Jonah is critical here. He was not a sailor successfully navigating the sea. He was swallowed whole, trapped inside the lightless, crushing belly of a massive, autonomous organism. Jonah had zero bodily autonomy regarding his trajectory or survival. The narrator maps this exact lack of autonomy onto his own current state inside the subject's gravitational pull. He recognizes that he is fully engulfed. He is trapped inside the architecture of a larger structural reality over which he has absolutely no control. Under this intense pressure, the narrator undergoes an identity recalibration. When you move, I'm put to mind of all that I want to be. The sheer force generated by the subject causes a total breakdown of language. He follows with, "I could never define all that you are to me," acknowledging that standard vocabulary fails in the face of this raw empirical data. This breakdown forces the narrator's physical submission in the chorus, "Shake like the bough of a willow tree." This introduces systemic stress. A willow tree does not fight a high-velocity wind event. It only survives the onslaught of kinetic energy through extreme involuntary flexibility. It bends so the trunk does not snap. The narrator then codifies this process as a mechanical law of physics. You are the right of movement. He specifies that its reasoning is made lucid and cool. This is not a chaotic, heated moment of passion. It is a precise mechanical transfer of energy functioning exactly as physics dictates. This leads to a crucial, devastating admission. And though it's no improvement, yielding to this force is not therapeutic, and it is not healing. It is simply the only physical way to survive the pressure without breaking. Moving into the second verse, the text actively rejects any notion of aesthetic kinetic energy. The first rejected model is the performative, choreographed motion of an entertainer, or Fred Astaire in sequins. The second rejected model is the athletic, explosive grace of a trained dancer, your Les Paulin and Leapin. The text discards both in favor of its ultimate demand, pure, static, load-bearing mass. Honey, you're Atlas. This schematic illustrates the terrifying physics of what follows. The subject is Atlas in his sleepin. Static mood-bearing mass holds immense weight entirely motionless by a fixed support. If the foundation is asleep, a single unconscious twitch triggers total existential collapse. The narrator's entire reality now rests completely and terrifyingly on the involuntary reflexes of the subject. The bridge of the song documents a reawakening under this weight. I can recall something that's gone from me, something so flawed and free. This operates like kinetic phantom limb syndrome. The overwhelming application of external force has reawakened nerves the narrator assumed were dead. The mention of the flaw is mathematically essential. A perfectly smooth, frictionless surface cannot sustain movement. It requires the rough edge of a flaw to generate traction. The text maps the final physical states required to achieve traction. First, move like gray skies, representing a slow, crushing meteorological inevitability. Second, move like a bird of paradise, representing sharp, sudden biological performativity. Third, move like an odd sight come out at night, representing the unpolished, subconscious emergence of a primal reality. The repetition of the final chorus signifies the system finally reaching equilibrium. Yielding is no longer an active choice to be made. It has become a permanent, inescapable structural reality. This diagram maps the final, unified physical reality of the text, a figure submerged, pinned down, with a massive, unstable load suspended directly overhead. The autopsy leaves us with a stark diagnosis. This is a document of existential defeat and absolute vulnerability. The semantic inversion is complete. In this environment, to be moved is absolutely not to dance. The true definition of movement in this text is the total surrender of your structural integrity to another human being. It is the stark, terrifying math of physical dependency, knowing that your ongoing survival is now permanently tied to their involuntary muscle spasms. The tension never resolves, because the text proves that the highest form of intimacy is not about rhythm. It is trusting someone who holds your entire world not to shift their weight in their sleep. While movement is frequently categorized as a romantic tribute to dance, its internal logic points toward a different framework, one where human motion is presented as the primary driver of existence. We are isolating the raw physics of a human being in motion, examining an action that no longer serves a system, performs for an audience, or follows a divine plan. The lyrics operate on a rule of 20th century philosophy. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, the idea that humans appear in the world first and only define what they are through what they do. Hozier explicitly maps this by defining the subject as a verb in perfect view. The individual is framed as an active process rather than a static physical object. Because the subject's identity is generated entirely by how they move through space, human meaning becomes a voluntary choice rather than an inherent trait. This creates a friction within the song between the literal mechanic of a body moving and the outward presentation of what that movement signifies. By stripping away the external motives for acting, like seeking approval or fulfilling a role, the text arrives at Albert Camus' philosophy of absurdism. We see this friction crystallize in a specific lyrical choice, the paradoxical metaphor of the Titan Atlas. Atlas carries the crushing weight of the entire universe. The lyrics frame this burden while refusing to acknowledge any grand narrative that would make the labor feel worth it. To exist authentically in this framework is to carry a massive burden while rejecting the premise that the burden requires a justification. Let's isolate the specific mechanics. The lyrics read, "You are the right of movement. It's reasonin' made lucid and cool." Camus wrote of lucid reasoning, noting its limits. Here, the right is stripped of religious weight. The reasoning is generated purely from the person moving. The text then systematically dismisses the peak of human performance. It references Sergei Polunin, a star of the Royal Ballet. Polunin represents institutionalized movement, motion executed within the rigid, structured expectations of an elite classical system. Then there is Fred Astaire, the embodiment of aestheticized movement, designed to perform for the gaze of an audience. In Sartrean terms, both figures risk engaging in bad faith, moving to comply with an external system, whether that is the institution of the ballet or the Hollywood machine. The song explicitly rejects them. You're less Polunin leaping or Fred Astaire in sequence. True movement operates outside the panopticon. It is not a performance for a witness. This brings us to the structural climax. Honey, your Atlas in his sleepin'. Atlas represents existential condemnation. For his defiance, the gods forced him to bear the weight of the heavens on his shoulders for eternity. But the text introduces a modifier. This Atlas is asleep. Divine punishment relies on the Titan's conscious agony to validate the power of the gods. By sleeping, the subject carries the exact same crushing weight, but removes the consciousness required for the punishment to land. This removes the necessary witness from the act of retribution. If a cosmic punishment requires the victim's conscious suffering to prove the punisher's authority, then a sleeping Atlas renders the system of control void. The lyrics then track a shift toward the return of something so flawed and free. This state maps onto Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the pre-socialized self, an entity acting on pure will, divorced from societal standards of behavior. The text actively dismisses Platonic ideals of perfection. Perfection is a cage built by external observers, whereas flaws are the evidence of an autonomous will. We see this confirmed as the lyrics pivot from human performers to natural elements. The subject moves like gray skies, a bird of paradise, or an odd sight come out at night. These are forces of cosmic indifference. A storm cloud doesn't move to impress a watcher. It simply occurs, unburdened by morality or a grand purpose. By aligning human action with indifferent nature, the subject sheds the requirement to be perfect for an observer. What remains is ontological freedom. This brings us to the recursive loop of the outro, the declaration that the subject has nothing left to lose and nothing to prove. Having nothing left to lose represents the philosophical death of hope. In strict existentialist terms, the death of hope is not a tragedy. Hope implies waiting for external salvation. Removing hope is the prerequisite for radical, actionable freedom. And having nothing to prove severs the final tether to the external observer. It negates the audience, rejects the institution and the divine. The subject is now completely self-contained. Their movement is executed freely, entirely outside the crushing panopticon of human judgment. The repetitive musical fade-out that closes the track operates as a sonic representation of Camus' eternal return. It directly mirrors Sisyphus, the condemned figure who must push a boulder up a mountain, watch it roll back down, and endlessly return to the bottom to begin again. Camus identified a survival mechanism within this loop, recognizing the inherent absurdity of the void, seeing that the labor has no cosmic meaning, and choosing to push the boulder anyway. Surviving an indifferent universe requires us to stop waiting for a script and become the sole authors of our own motion. The ultimate act of absurdist rebellion is to strip away the audiences, the systems, and the gods, and to move simply because we choose to.